And right now I'd like to have Andy Trotter kick things off with a little introduction about the program and himself. Andy is the chair of the Tree Care for Birds program. All right, take it away, Andy.
Thank you, Ryan. And thank you, everybody, for your interest in attending the program that we're putting on. It's been a real pleasure working with different people from the Western chapter on this program over the last 6 years. And a lot of thanks go out to CAL FIRE and the Britain Fund, who provided monetary support for the program to get started about 6 years ago. We have a tremendous amount of committee support led by our writing committee, Ryan, Kara Donohue, and Corey Bassett. And so we really appreciate the work that they've done. The new BMPs are now inclusive of the 4 Western states, are just ready for print, quite frankly, today. And it's exciting that they'll soon be going out to actually get printed in hard copy. But Ryan's going to review them with you and also show you how you can access them and use them right away. So there's a growing interest in this subject that I found from my experience in tree care. Really, I kind of consider myself an urban forester. And, so there's a lot of different reasons that this subject is of interest to me. With the field crews that we have, we want good public relations. And there's a tremendous amount of people out there that are interested in the environment, in particular birds. And so as arborists, we have that opportunity to do something positive in this area, or we also have the opportunity to, do negative things and end up being in a negative limelight out there. So this whole subject is, and you guys participating in the training is going to help the arborists, do the right thing and be able to present our industry in a positive light. That's certainly an important thing with public relations, but I've also found that, the wildlife and birds in our urban forests can also be almost a barometer of the health of the urban forest. And as a person, and like I'm sure many of you that enjoy outdoors and nature, it just becomes much more three-dimensional when you start to have all these different elements working together. So again, thank you all for your participation. Hopefully you'll apply this, whether you're an urban forest manager or a tree climber or however you do your job, and share with others. There's a growing interest out there, and I appreciate everybody's support. Ryan, let's send it back to you.
Kara Donohue is with us as well. She's a avian biologist for a utility company in Southern California. She's going to be handling most of the question and answer discussion sort of period. Kara, do you have anything you'd like to add before we get started?
No, thanks. Looking forward to it.
All right. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and my background and my sort of credentials in talking about trees and birds. I grew up in a very unusual horticultural family. This is my artwork when I was young, and I can tell you every single thing that I ever drew had a tree in it. And that trees were almost always homes for different kinds of wildlife. I think this might be a horse of some sort. I'm not quite sure. But anyways, I grew up in an unusual horticultural family and really thought about trees a lot when I was young. And that sort of framed how I think about trees today as I became a consulting arborist. So I worked with the Hort Science crew down for almost 10 years down in the San Francisco Bay Area before I moved up here to Portland, Oregon. I started out as a field tech doing a lot of tree inventory work, GIS mapping, things like that, and eventually developed a specialty in tree preservation, trying to keep trees protected during construction projects. And so the next presentation that I'm preparing for now is at the ISA conference. We're going to talk about the construction BMPs. I'm working on those with Dr. Smiley and some others, and sort of how the next draft is going to look, how the next version of those best management practices can help arborists be more effective on those projects. For the last couple of years, I've really been focused on training, and not only training you all about wildlife, but arborists in how to be better consultants and how to offer consulting services. So that's where I've put a lot of my energy in the last couple of years. In parallel, I've had a focus on wildlife. And so my master's degree is in international nature conservation. And this is one of the projects that I did while I was working on that, where in Germany, we studied the gray partridge in agriculture fields and tried to figure out how likely it was to survive with different scenarios. And I became a master birder through the Golden Gate Audubon Society and California Academy of Sciences. I spent a lot of my time out looking at birds. That's what I like doing with my free time. On Saturday, I'm leading a bird trip here in Portland to go check out some great birds in our area. I started volunteering at a wildlife rehabilitation center in back when I was living in Berkeley over in Walnut Creek, where I really could learn a lot about how injured birds come in and how they're cared for. But mostly I've been a part of this program for a long time since we started it back in 2015. And so I spend most of my time creating educational materials for you all, for arborists, and doing different types of trainings and workshops like we're doing today. But like I said, I also focus from the other end, where I try to reach out to birding communities and talk to them about trees. So on a lot of my birding trips, I bring in some arboriculture and start talking to people about how important trees are to birds as well as the other way around. So going into this program, Tree Care for Birds started as just a group of people together who were interested in tackling this issue of what's going on between these conflicts of wildlife and tree care. And we, so we got together, we had arborists, wildlife biologists, wildlife advocates, and city officials, and all sorts of other agency officials together in one room, and we started talking about it. And I think overall, we came up with 4 basic ideas of what we saw going on. That tree care workers generally wish to act responsible around wildlife, but most of them seem to not be aware of how to do that. That the wildlife laws and regulations, such as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in the United States, were relatively unknown to the tree care industry, and that put workers at risk of pretty significant fines and criticism. That wildlife, especially nesting wildlife, seem to be vulnerable to impacts from tree care, both directly and sort of indirectly through habitat modification. And that simple advice, such as avoid tree care during the breeding season, was often recommended, but it failed to protect wildlife that breed outside of that time period, and it stood to potentially decimate the tree care industry if implemented on a large enough scale. And so that's really, those are the ideas that we tried to bring into this program and build around. And I hope that we've brought some materials that's really helpful for you today. So thinking about today, your screen should look something sort of like this, where basically your audio and video have been turned off to try to eliminate the chaos of everyone joining and leaving and things like that. And so your main way to interact with us is going to be through the question and answer chat. And so let's use the chat for sharing things with people. So for example, I just shared the handout in the chat here so that you can all access the handout for today through my Dropbox link in there. So you can share things, you can ask people questions here. But if you want to ask, Kara and I a question about the content, that's where the question and answer tab is really for, and how we can best utilize that. And that's going to be an important part of today. Please start asking questions now, and Kara's going to come in and interrupt me, and we'll work through those. We'll save some of them towards the end as well. One thing I always do when I get in here is I start messing with everything and make the speaker a little bigger. You guys set up yours however you want. So in the handout, in that Dropbox link, hopefully the first page looks something about like this for you. And we're going to talk a little bit about what this program is, right? So what we're planning on doing is, number one is today, what we're doing right now. We have scheduled until 12:30. We'll stay on until about 1 in case anybody has any more questions and we have some good discussion. But basically, we're going to talk about the main parts of the best management practice. And then we have 2 homework assignments for you to watch at least 2 videos and take some quizzes associated with those videos. I'll mention there's also quizzes for today. And then on December 2nd, we'll get together, but broken into smaller groups, so that from 11 a.m. to noon, that's when we're going to talk mostly about Arizona and Nevada. From noon to 1 p.m., we'll mostly talk about California. And from 1 to 2 p.m., we'll mostly talk about Hawaii. And so you can come to all of these sessions, watch all the videos, take all the quizzes, but you need to come to at least one, the session today, one of the sessions on December 2nd, and do those 2 homework assignments. I think I forgot to mention the other homework assignment, which was to perform a pre-work inspection and to submit that inspection form to us. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. So if you go to the second page of the handout, that shows us what we're doing today, where basically I'm going to zoom in on the schedule. So we're about done with introductions and administration, and we're going to jump into the importance of wildlife before we talk about the wildlife best management practices, in particular, minimizing impacts to wildlife. We're going to also hit on a little bit of managing wildlife habitat if we have time before doing a little wrap up and talk about the homework and some question and answer up to 1 o'clock if depending on how much discussion we have. I'll point out there's also additional resources here and sort of main points. And so you can take some notes today. You can try to find these resources as I bring them up, but they're all for you right here. So you should be able to find them afterwards using the handout. No reason to take too many notes here. The third page is about the videos. And so here you can pick at least 2 videos, and I've broken them down for you sort of color coded as to if I was in Hawaii, I would watch the 2 Hawaiian videos. And if I was in California, I would watch the 2 where we talked about California. These are videos from last year's programs that cover, I think, really great content and give you real in-depth insight into different topics related to specific areas. And so if you're not from the Western chapter, a Western chapter state, so for instance, we saw someone from New Mexico, I would definitely check out this Arizona and Nevada sections. Almost everyone from the rest of the United States are likely going to be, those are going to be the best videos to check out and the best session to attend on the last day on December 2nd, because the legal structure is so different here, here in California. I'm in Oregon. In California, I spent most of my career in California, so I still stay here in California. And so, but if you're somewhere with strong legal protections, British Columbia comes to mind. California might be a better option for you. So anyways, pick and choose what works best for you. But our general goals, going back to sort of the first page of the handout again, are to train arborists to access and understand the wildlife BMPs. And so let's just dive into some of these goals here. So if you go to the Tree Care for Birds website and click on BMPs and handouts and click on this sort of photo or the link below it, you pull up the wildlife best management practices. There are also links to it in the handout as well. And if you maybe think you're looking at an older version, consider looking for this with Western Chapter ISA appendices and October 26, 2021. That's the most current version that we're using right now. That's what's up on our website right now. And so I was saying that we want to create some wildlife trained arborists. That's our goal for today. And so this is a term that we invented a few years ago. And our current definition of it is that this is someone with knowledge of wildlife protection regulations, determining habitat value, conducting pre-work nesting inspections, identifying signs of nesting wildlife, determining if nests are active, basically if it has eggs or young wildlife in them, responding to wildlife emergencies, and contacting wildlife biologists when needed. So these are the things we're hoping to give you a little bit of knowledge about during this program so that you all can go and practice and try to function as a wildlife trained arborist out there in the field, because that's what we're really trying to do here. And so I'll point out that we also want to create urban forests that are inviting to wildlife. And so how are we going to do that without arborists being integrally involved in that? And so we'll try to focus a little bit on that today. I think we always focus more on the minimizing impact section. Hopefully we'll have enough time for a little bit of this wildlife habitat section, and we can always talk more about that at future times. Why wildlife are important. And I struggle a little bit with this topic because wildlife are a really important part of my life. And to me, they're sort of really obviously important. And so I'm going to make a couple of arguments here, but to me, I just sort of feel that wildlife are really important. And so that's what resonates with me more. But there was an article 2 years ago that came out that North America had lost nearly 3 billion birds since the 1970s. And several of these articles were sort of widely shared within my circles. And so I looked up the papers and dug into it a little bit. And it looks like about 30%, we have about 30% lower bird populations here in North America than in 50 years ago. And this seems to be a global trend. The number globally is pretty similar to that. And I think that we can assume that most of those changes are not sort of the responsibility of arborists, that we don't play a big role in that. But when we go to the urban ecology sort of wildlife conferences, one of the things that they hammer on a lot is the tie between bird diversity and numbers and canopy cover. And that's something that we do have quite a big impact in and something that we are focused on. So I like looking at these canopy assessments in different communities. So City of Vancouver is up here just across the bridge from me. And it's pretty typical in what I see when I look up these reports, where we've lost about 1% of our canopy cover in this sort of 7 to 10 year period. And we work so hard to build up our canopy, and we're still sort of incrementally, slowly losing it. And that the finding in this report, and most that I read, is that we're really losing private property canopy while sort of steadily increasing parks and street trees and things like that. Every community is a little different, but I'd say this is the most common finding that I see. And that we know that we play key roles in this, right? We're removing trees, we're assessing trees, we're planting trees all over the place, and that these are, we don't have complete control over the urban forest and the canopy cover in our communities, but we certainly play an important role, and that's something that we can keep in mind. We know that arborists have at least some role in wildlife populations because there's been some incidents, right? So in Oakland a few years ago, there was an incident where a tree care company climbed a tree, some herons fell out of the nests onto the ground and were injured. Audubon came by, so some Audubon members happened to be in the area, and they called the police, and it got stopped, and all these things happened. During the investigation, they decided not to charge the tree care companies, largely because they said, hey, we didn't know. And now that we do know, we are pay for the care, we'll be, spread the word, things like that. And so I think they did a good job of responding to it. But I decided I would go look at the site, and so this is the ficus tree in downtown Oakland, relatively close to Lake Merritt, and seems like a relatively low habitat value as you're walking up to it. And then all of a sudden, you see this whitewash all over the sidewalk. And I looked up, and there were these squawking black-crowned night herons all over this tree. So it wasn't that they didn't know that there were birds in the tree. It was that they didn't know that these birds were protected and that there were ways to sort of avoid this from happening. So I started talking to other arborists and found that they didn't know much about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, that it wasn't clear what activities were allowed and not allowed and how you should approach these sorts of problems. And then a couple of months later, the same thing happened in Southern California. This time it was a demolition crew, not a tree care company. But I think that the message started getting around that tree removals were killing and injuring birds, and that we were starting to see some impacts from that. So I went to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center that took care of the herons as they recovered after this incident. And I took a photo of a sign right next to the phone that said, like, advice for callers who are witnessing removal of nests with eggs and birds. Take pictures and videos with like 10 exclamation marks and like, go and confront them and all this stuff. And I was like, wow, these are arborists out there who are going to get confronted. We need to do something. We need to start telling them, hey, this is important, and these are really important. Wildlife are super important to our communities and to the people out there in the public and our clients, and we want to make sure that you all have the information you need to be able to navigate these situations. Similarly, you can look at some of the literature being put out. So like one of the Audubons had some literature saying, did you know that tree trimming in spring and early summer is irresponsible and possibly illegal? The city of Poway has a moratorium on pruning from March 15th to June 15th of their street trees. So this is just a really important topic to a lot of people. So we wanted to make sure we're getting some knowledge out there into the tree care community about how strongly certain people feel about wildlife and that it's a good idea to act responsibly, even regardless of what the laws are. So let's talk a little bit about what the laws say. And I want to just bring up that this is federal laws, right? So here again, here in California, the laws are such, there are many additional laws to this. So I'm going to say things here that apply federally, but maybe won't apply specifically in California because we have additional laws. So let's remember, if you're in California, to tune into those videos and see what's different about the laws that I mentioned there. But both the best management practices and this training is designed such that we're focused very, very broadly today, and then we'll get narrower. So the first federal law to talk about is the Eagle Act. There are two eagles in the United States, the bald eagle shown here and the golden eagle. And they basically have very high levels of protection. Not only are the birds and active nests protected, the inactive nests are protected, right? So can't remove an eagle nest even in the winter when there's no eggs in it. The Endangered Species Act is another federal law to be aware of. There's about 2,500 species of endangered species. I don't think we see many of these in the tree care industry. I think there's lots of other industries more focused on this, but certainly we do see some. So in Hawaii, for example, we're focused on, both of the videos are focused on endangered species. So the threatened manooku, the white tern, we have a whole video on that. And the Hawaiian hoary bat is endangered, and so we have another video on that. So if you're interested in endangered species, check out the two Hawaiian videos because you'll get a little bit more in depth about the Endangered Species Act and what's going on in Hawaii. Finally, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is probably what we're going to be bumping up against the most. This is a red-breasted nuthatch. Forgot to mention we have a California condor above. But basically, there's 1,000 of species protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act approximately. And it doesn't matter if they migrate. It doesn't matter if they travel between country lines or anything like that. What matters is, are they native to the United States? And they are protected, and their active nests are protected if they have eggs or young in those nests. And so this is sort of a moderate level of protection compared to the other two. The Endangered Species Act and the Eagle Act offer much more protection. But this applies to many, many more species, ones that we are going to see in our cities. So if you're really interested in more about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, we have a whole video on it where we dig into not only the act itself, but the enforcement and the policy around that enforcement. So the M opinion is something that you may have heard about and will learn a lot about in this video here. We don't focus on that today or really at all in the best management practices because we think there's lots of reasons to act responsibly around wildlife besides the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So I'll just gloss over that for now and tell you to go check out this video. Finally, we have references to wildlife in our important industry documents. So the ANSI A300 standards, both the pruning and the tree risk assessment, are two of the most important documents that we have in the tree care industry. And they both mention the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, they both mention the Endangered Species Act, and they both mention wildlife in reference to doing pre-work inspections and managing for wildlife habitat in sort of different ways through these documents. And then the best management practices produced by ISA go a little further than that. So they give a little bit of insight into these pre-work inspections and what they might include. They give a little bit of insight into managing for wildlife habitat might include preserving dead and dying trees and how to think about assessing them for risk and how to approach that. And then our best management practices on top of that are really fitting well within the system, I think, of building on top of what these have already said, right? So pre-work inspections are important. How do you do a pre-work inspection? Let's focus on that. We want to preserve dead and dying trees. What do we really need to do here? And so that's how we consider us our part of working into these sort of industries. So the video we watched earlier was a hairy woodpecker, and this is a brown creeper, one of my favorites. Kara, do you want to jump in and say something about the M opinion and how that's changed? I figure what we'll do is we'll address that in December, but anything that you want to just say about it right now?
Yeah, I think that more in depth in December will be good. But yeah, since the administration change in the White House, the previous M opinion that took away protection for birds from incidental take, which is harming, basically killing or injuring birds by accident or just incidental to otherwise lawful activities. That M opinion has been rescinded, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is now proposing to create a Migratory Bird Treaty Act permit program for incidental take. So we can get into that more in December, if that makes more sense.
Great. I'm hoping we can dig into that a little bit from 11 to 12 o'clock in December at the Arizona and Nevada time, because like I said, in California, this hasn't seemed to affect very much. So one of the most important things that's happened in the last couple of years for our program is that Tree Care for Birds became a program of the Western Chapter. And this came with huge numbers of benefits, many, many benefits, but also some problems. And so we had written these wildlife best management practices for California, and now we had to add in both, the deserts of Phoenix and Las Vegas and the tropical islands of, Hawaii and Honolulu. How were we going to create something that covered all of these different aspects and all the different things that we needed to do? And so we had the California best management practices. We wanted to change them to these full Western Chapter. And so we looked a little bit at sort of starting over and, how we could approach it differently. But what we ended up doing was breaking what we had, the 2018 document, into these main best management practices where we stripped everything about California out of it, and a California appendix. And then we added appendices for Arizona, Nevada, and Hawaii. So we reached out to different project partners, and we're so appreciative to have local experts in each of these states help us create these appendices and really tell us what's important about those regions and what we need to sort of do a little differently. I'll point out that Hawaii is obviously the most different. And so the structure, I think, works pretty well for everyone else, and I think will work well for other areas in the United States and abroad. But Hawaii is pretty unique, but I think we made it work pretty well. The main best management practices, as I just said, really aren't even designed for the Western Chapter, are designed really broadly, so they could be applicable to other states, other regions. So if you're in a different area and want to start experimenting with this, it was built for you. We just need to come up with a couple of details for what exactly we need to do differently. So let's dive into what the best management practices recommend and how we go about doing that. So the first recommendation that it makes is to have contact information for a wildlife biologist in your area. On the Tree Care for Birds website, we have a list going about people, wildlife biologists, and where they're working. So let us know if we should add anyone to the list. Go there and try to see if you can find that helpful. And I'll point out that Courtney is a wildlife biologist who, at least last I talked, was available for hire and shared a lot of insight with us in the California videos. So if you're looking for a wildlife biologist in Southern California, there's many options. Courtney is definitely one of them, and make sure you check out those videos. I want to point out that we rely a lot on wildlife biologists in the best management practices, but depending on where you are, that might not be the only or even best option. So in the Nevada video, we have two Jessicas from NDOW, the Nevada Department of Wildlife, come and join us and tell us that they're, available for questions and can help you problem solve. I haven't found contacting wildlife agencies very helpful personally, and have found going through wildlife biologists to be more effective. but maybe in your area that would be more effective. And so I would definitely consider that as an option as well. So once we have our wildlife biologist, the next recommendation is to have contact information for a wildlife rehabilitation center. So here's a map of we have an interactive map in Arizona showing all the wildlife rehabilitation centers, which is great. And this is in case you have a wildlife emergency. These are going to be, you have to make decisions quickly and you're not sure what to do. Having contact information ready to go of where your closest wildlife rehabilitation center is key. And I think that could be really helpful in responding to a wildlife emergency. Again, in our Arizona, Nevada section, we have Laura Hackett from Liberty Wildlife show us not only, birds we might expect to see in Arizona, nests that associate with those birds so that you could maybe be able to identify that, but about how to respond to wildlife emergencies, what types of wildlife emergencies she sees, and things like that. So once you've got your wildlife biologist and your wildlife rehabilitation center contact information all set, the next step is to figure out the breeding season. And this is going to change region to region. So check out your individual appendix, check out, maybe talk to Audubon in different regions. This is what some data that I put together for the San Francisco Bay Area. And I think it's pretty consistent outside of Hawaii, outside of very tropical places, that late spring, early summer seems to be when most of the breeding happens. And when we certainly can see this change, especially down in, let's say, Southern California, Arizona, where it's warm year round, you might see more breeding in sort of December, January time period, something like that. But the two big takeaways are there is a breeding season where most breeding happens, but in a lot of places there's breeding sort of year round and you might always find a nest, but we would think that's much more likely during certain periods of time. The next step is to figure out your wildlife habitat value of the site that you're working in. So this could vary from, pretty low habitat value in this parking lot to pretty high habitat value in this, urban wildlife forest nature area that's being managed on the bottom here, to maybe really high in sensitive areas like riparian areas, maybe some designated critical habitat, or somewhere where we're really expecting to find a lot of wildlife, maybe a lot of protected wildlife. That doesn't mean that we won't find nests in this parking lot or in the spaces in between. There's obviously a lot of space in between these different examples, but it means that we're more likely to in certain areas, and we want to be cognizant of that. So we bring these two ideas together of our breeding season and our habitat value to come up with what we call categories. And these categories basically associate with what level of training do we think is appropriate to work in those areas. And so if we're working in the non-breeding season in low habitat value areas, we think an awareness training might be good enough. If we're working in the breeding season in a low habitat value area or in the non-breeding season in a high habitat value area, we think that what we're doing today, we're trying to get everyone to this wildlife trained arborist level, might be good enough, and that should give you the skills you need to be able to go out there with a little bit of practice. And if you're working in high habitat value areas in the breeding season or in sensitive habitats all the time, maybe a wildlife biologist should be involved in that project. So generally for these awareness training situations, this basically is we think everyone should have a little bit of training. There's a video on the Tree Care for Birds website that we think covers the basics. This one's still focused in California, so maybe by December 2nd, we'll have put out a new video or series of videos that is more broadly applicable than just California. But once you've determined what sort of is the adequate level of training, then the next step is to do a pre-work inspection. And this could happen, just before the project or a few days before the project, but someone is going out there, with some level of training and expertise in how to do this, to look for nests and look for signs of nesting wildlife. And so we want to be aware of nests. And I think when we think of nests, when most people think of nests, we think of this classic American robin's cup nest, but that nests can look like lots of different things, right? So we want to be aware of cavity nests and nests that dangle down from palm fronds, from nests that are way up high in the tree and nests that are on the ground. All of these nests are sort of equally protected, are protected, and we need to sort of be able to identify them and be able to work responsibly around them. These nests could be anywhere from the tops of the trees to the shrubs to the bottom. And we want to be just going out there and looking for them all around our project area, not just in the tree that we're working in, but maybe the trees around it as well, spending a little bit of time with that. And when we talk about signs of nesting wildlife, we've defined that as sort of nests that we're not sure we can tell whether they're active or not. So we have this pendulous bush tit nest and this cavity nest. I think, I don't remember what was living in there. And both of these would be difficult to tell whether they're active. Are there eggs in there? So we'd have to use other signs. We'd have to spend a little time with it and thinking about this as being a little bit more difficult. So for example, when I found this nest, up in the rafters of the gazebo, I didn't find the nest. I found the whitewash, the droppings underneath it, and then looked up for the nest. Or we can look for breeding behavior from the birds, from the adult birds. So for example, this house finch is collecting nesting material. So if we see it collecting nesting material and see it fly off, we might be able to not only find the nest, but say, hey, we're pretty sure there's a nest somewhere in this area. We may want to listen for other types of breeding behavior. That's a sign of nesting wildlife. So this California scrub jay here do you hear how harsh that is and how repeated single call? So this is their alarm call. And this is a sign that they're worried about something and they might be worried about us and they might be protecting our nest. So keep an ear out for how the wildlife are sounding around you. That can give you some hints as to whether they might be nesting in that area. Just hearing this call doesn't mean like, hey, I can't work in this area. It's just clues that we're trying to figure things out. So I'm gonna play that one more time. We've also got another bird returning the call in there. Okay, and so often we can use the adults to help us find the nest. So I would have never found this hummingbird nest except I saw the female gathering up nesting materials and come and building this nest. So let's check this out together. So what we have here is she's collected some lichen and some spider webs and some other materials, and she's weaving them together. So during this stage of nest building is a really good time to find this nest because the adult's moving back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth, and we can sort of follow the adult to the nest location. But as she lays her eggs and starts incubating those eggs, it becomes much more difficult because she's so stationary, and that's a time when finding nests can be very difficult, right? So the ease of finding them can change over time. So right here, she's just hanging out on her nest. She doesn't move around at all. And it can be a really hard time to find the nest. And then we have another opportunity again here once the young have hatched, because mom's gonna be collecting insects and bringing them back. And these hummingbirds have to eat like every 15 minutes. So mom's gonna be visiting the nest every 15 minutes. And so that gives us another opportunity to go and find these nests, and just by being aware of the wildlife moving around us, we could potentially avoid a pretty serious impact here. I like this video. I think it's pretty cool. All right, I think that's about it for our hummingbird video here. So we have some forms to help us work through this process. And so the two up above are available on the Tree Care for Birds website. We also have a digital version that Arizona has built for us. And I checked in with them about whether this one's still working and how it works. And I haven't heard back yet. So for now, let's plan on using these two forms up at the top. But I'll be in touch about what we find out about using this sort of survey 1, 2, 3 form and whether we want to do something else moving forward. So we're really focused on nests and focus on nests that have eggs or young in them. And so once we've determined whether that there is a nest and we've checked out whether it has eggs or young in it, what we why we're so focused on that is because wildlife are really good at avoiding us, right? Like trying to catch a bird or a squirrel or something that's just, an adult running around is basically impossible for us. But during this time period, the young and the eggs are so vulnerable, right? They're so fragile and they're stationary. They can't run away from us as we approach. And so when we come into their zone, we're impacting them, we're scaring them away. And when we're making noise, this can scare the parents away and really cause problems. And so we're not only concerned about cutting off these branches, cutting down this tree and impacting them that way, but how is just our presence and the noise we're in there affecting them? And that's because we want the adults to stay there at the nest and be able to protect their young from the elements, protect their young from predators, be there to continue feeding them. Because you can imagine that as mom leaves, so this robin, when it leaves, these young are not going to survive very well on their own, right? They need constant attention. The other thing, and so like one of the bigger impacts we can have is if we scare the parents enough that they abandon the nest entirely and leave their young to die. And that's, both been sort of had legal concerns, right, in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and other things, and in, our responsibilities. We want these wildlife to continue caring for their young. The other thing that can happen as we approach, or if we're working in an area with an active nest, is we can have the young fledge early. So this happens naturally, and we can cause it to happen a little more, where this raven has jumped out of the nest and is down on the ground, and I'm not sure why, but mom is hanging out above and taking care of it and whatever. So I didn't do anything in this situation. I don't think mom would have let me. But this is one of the things we're trying to avoid. We're trying to not scare young out of the nest, allow them to stay in the nest so that they can continue being cared for until they're ready to fly. So if we found an active nest during our pre-work inspection, or even if we didn't find it, but we found it during our tree work, and we sort of, what do we do at that point? So we take a step back and we say, okay, I found this nest. What work do I have planned? So if I'm pruning the branch or the tree or removing the entire tree for this nest that's up in this branch here, I'm pretty sure that I'm going to impact this nest, right? Definitely impact this nest. And so lining up what we find with our pre-work inspection with our planned work for the day is the next step. And so if this is the case, we're going to have to delay our work. We're going to say, hey, we'll come back in a couple of weeks, see if the nest is inactive. Once the young have flown away and they're not reliant on that nest, we'll do our work then. If our work is scheduled hundreds and hundreds of feet away, we wouldn't have even found this nest. We wouldn't be even wandering over here. But if our tree work is really, really far away from a nest, then we're very unlikely to impact that nest. And so we can go ahead and do that work. Maybe the most complicated question is, well, what if we're pruning a branch in this tree? What if we're removing the shrub nearby or a tree nearby or something else? And that's the hard questions here. That's when we really don't know what to do, and when wildlife biologists have an expertise in this. And so generally, our best tool for being able to protect active nests is to use a no activity buffer. So this is a lot like, I use tree protection zones a lot in my work, right? Of we're not going to do any work within 100 feet or 200 feet or 500 feet. For a golden eagle, we have 1 mile written here. And so we're picking these relatively big areas in which we're protecting these nests and not doing work in there until the young have left. And once the young have left, we can generally go ahead and complete our work, assuming it's not an eagle nest or something else that is protected while it's inactive. Okay, so I want to point out that these are really big, these buffers, in our recommendations. And working with a wildlife biologist can allow you to reduce these sometimes, right? The wildlife biologist can say, okay, well, let's go ahead and work closer, but I'm going to keep an eye on it. The wildlife biologist can say, well, why don't you use hand tools and you can do this? Wildlife biologists have incredible expertise in being able to set these buffers and negotiate these sorts of things. And so let's rely on them whenever we can to, when we need to work in these areas. but mostly what we're going to say is, hey, let's back off and reschedule work for later. There are definitely going to be situations where we have emergencies, right? Where tree care needs to happen or people are going to die. And so I thought that, let's see here. I thought that the Hawaii group said it best. I'm going to show that real quick, and then I'm going to come back to this. Of an emergency of convenience is not the same thing as a real emergency. And so what we recommend in the wildlife best management practices is to do a level 2 tree risk assessment with a track qualified individual. And so what we would do here is I've set up sort of a overly simplified model for, this probably isn't exactly what I would do, but just to give us an idea of how we might approach this. So let's say we have a tree that we think is dangerous with an active nest in it. And so we have, so basically we go and do our risk assessment. And if we find that the risk is low, we're not going to do this work for risk reasons, right? If low risk is within my risk tolerance, and we're just going to say, okay, we'll move on to something else. If we find that the risk is moderate, we'll say, okay, we'll remove that tree or we'll prune that tree after the young have left the nest, right? A moderate risk we can tolerate for a short period of time until the nest has finished, and we'll take care of it then. If we have a high risk tree, that means that that's maybe our most difficult situation where we're going to say, hey, I need to problem solve with a wildlife biologist. So what I would do is I would call a wildlife biologist, ask them to meet me at the site, and we'd figure out what we could do. And that might mean that we take drastic action, but more likely we'd figure out some things of, can we limit public access in this area? Can we make sure we exhaust all of our options before we go and remove the tree and remove the nest and something like that? I think that our wildlife agencies are going to have pretty high risk tolerance. We're going to have to sort of prove that this was a real high or extreme situation. In an extreme situation, I'd certainly be calling my wildlife biologist and ask them to meet me out there, but I would act. I would scoop up that nest, bring it to a wildlife rehabilitation center, and I would start, I would document it really well, right? I would mitigate the risk. I would document, take lots of photos, take lots of notes, and say to the wildlife agencies like, hey, I'm sorry, this was an extreme situation. I've maybe only seen 1 or 2 extreme risk trees ever. Maybe there's people out there who see them all the time in their work, but I think this would be a relatively rare occurrence, and that if we could sort of go through this system pretty formally, we would find that there are fewer real emergencies and a lot of emergencies of convenience, and that we should definitely be responding during these real emergencies. That if we're in an extreme risk situation, I would hate to see people die because a tree care company, a tree crew, a city was so concerned about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So let's try to avoid that as well. And so making sure, and there's a different kind of emergency, right? So a wildlife emergency. And so again, a wildlife emergency is not, hey, there's a nest in a tree that I need to work in, and so I'm going to remove that nest and take it to a wildlife rehabilitation center. An example of a wildlife emergency is when this ficus tree that had 100 birds in it and 30 eggs splits in half. And so they scooped up all the wildlife off the street here, brought them into the wildlife rehabilitation center, assessed this tree and said, oh man, this tree's about to fail again, and then sent climbers up and had people sort of grabbing the nest out of the tree and taking them to the rehab centers before removing this, mitigating the risk of this tree. So if we've done everything that we can to assess the situation, determine that it's try to avoid impacting a nest, and we just honestly missed something, right? There was a nest that was really well hidden. I didn't notice it. I cut the branch and now I notice it, and we want to bring that into the center. I think that's a real wildlife emergency. And if we've done everything we can to avoid wildlife emergencies, but we have them, we want to make sure that we're responding appropriately. And the best thing to do is to have contact information for the local rehabilitation center. Call them and ask them what to do. They almost always have a hotline with people who will say, hey, bring that bird in. Hey, leave that bird there. Hey, we don't even take that kind of wildlife. You know, don't just scoop it up and bring it in, because there's so many different situations that we can't be prepared for all of them. We want to talk to the real experts about it. And a lot of these wildlife rehabilitation people, while the organizations are run often on volunteer power, they really have a lot of expertise there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the homework assignment. So we talked about the videos already, but we also have a pre-work inspection that we want to do for our homework assignment. And so I don't expect many of you to find active nests or to find, you know, real strong signs of nesting wildlife. But the wildlife best management practices have us do these pre-work inspections even in the non-breeding season, right? We're here in November. We'd be pretty surprised to find active nests just about anywhere except Hawaii. So it's a great time to practice without a lot of sort of consequences, right? We can go out there, we can fill out our forms, and we can test this. So page 4 of your handout has all the instructions about how to do that. So the first instruction is watch one of the videos. If you're in Nevada or Arizona or California, or basically anywhere else, watch one of those videos to see how we look at and talk about the pre-work inspections. And then go out and try it for yourself. Download one of our forms, give it a try, and then email that along with a picture to tcbw@wcisa.net. If you're in Hawaii, it's a little bit different. If you're in the Honolulu area, what we'd like you to do is go check out a white-turned nest and do a little activity with that. And if you're not in the Honolulu area, you're not going to have that option. So go ahead and do something more like the California and Nevada section. And so this is just a good way for us to practice. We ask that you have that turned into us by November 29th if you want your certificate. And we'll go over some of these activities, like who turned them in, and sort of look at some good examples so that we can dig into that a little bit deeper in our December section. Okay, so how are we doing for time here? We're doing okay. So I'm gonna break into managing wildlife habitat for just a second here. Kara, is there anything you wanna talk about before I do that while we're still on our minimizing impacts to wildlife? Anything you wanna emphasize?
No, we have a couple of questions, but if you want, I've given preliminary answers to them, and it can wait till you are done, or I can go ahead and read them to you now.
Yeah, let's go ahead and wrap this up, and then we can go from there. So we'll save the questions for the end here.
Sounds good.
Okay, so managing wildlife habitat is a pretty difficult topic, and I don't have all the answers, but we do have a section of that in the best management practices, so definitely check that out. But I want to emphasize a couple of things that are really just sort of ideas to get you started. And the first one is, I've seen this practice happening several different places from different arborists of moving away from the term defect, and that trees are not defective, never defective. Defects is a really negative framing of a natural process in a tree, right? And so when we see cavities and we see dead branches and we see conchs, framing them as defects is, framing them as something that should be removed. And an equally correct way to frame it, that we haven't been doing much in arboriculture, is to frame it positively as wildlife habitat, as important places for birds and other wildlife to be able to collect materials, eat, nest, and all sorts of other things. And so this is just a great illustration that I like from Brian French, talking about all of these defects and framing them as features. So I've started using features as a more neutral term, and thinking about these defects in our trees in slightly different ways that allows me to be able to communicate a little bit better, I think, about wildlife habitat in our urban forest. So I have here a somewhat idealized growth and death of a tree over time. And when we think about how sort of humans value trees, and I don't really mean appraise the value of trees, right, of like financially. I mean, like, I think that generally humans give a lot of value to big, healthy trees, and that we don't really value, small, recently planted trees or dead trees or logs or anything like that very much, right? As soon as trees start declining in health, we really start thinking that they have quite a bit less value. And if this is just a somewhat crazy speculation, but if I were managing for wildlife habitat, if I was thinking like a bird, I might value trees differently, right? I might think that these big dying trees are really valuable, are really important habitat to me. And that if we were to compare the two between how humans value trees and how wildlife value trees, I'd say that we are overvaluing these young, healthy trees and undervaluing these standing dead trees, these dying trees, these stumps or logs on the ground and things like that. And so thinking about, as arborists, what we can do to get a few more years out of our mature, potentially declining, senescent, we use a lot of over mature, a lot of words for these trees that I think sort of shows that we're not valuing them very highly. And so if we can start to try to give a little bit more value to those trees and try to extend their lifelines, or their lifetime a little bit longer, I think that we can do a lot in urban forestry to be able to have better wildlife habitat in our urban forests. And what's so important about our skill set is that we have so many tree risk qualified individuals out there, arborists out there, who can actually assess the danger of these trees. And we often are removing dead and dying trees, saying that they're dangerous, when what we're really doing is not valuing them very much and not sort of appreciating the benefits that they provide. And so if we can adequately weigh the risk that trees provide, the risk that trees pose, and the benefits that they provide, I think that's how we're going to how we always make great urban forestry decisions. And thinking about how we do that towards the end of a tree's life can be really important, in roles that we could take on. In the Pacific Northwest here, there are snags all over the place. The arborist community, 30, 40 years ago, really embraced leaving snags and the importance of wildlife habitat that they bring. And it's an amazing part of the Pacific Northwest, and something that I hope spreads other places, but I know has some challenges in front of it. And these dead and dying trees, one of the things that they really provide are great habitat for cavity nesting species. So these woodpeckers and secondary cavity nesters are so reliant on these dead and dying and decayed trees, and we're removing them constantly from our urban forest. And I suspect that these secondary cavity nesters, right? So a woodpecker excavates out a cavity and uses it for 1 year and then leaves, and other birds come in and use it years after that. Those secondary cavity nesters really could benefit from us extending the lifeline of those trees and appreciating that trees that have cavities in them, yes, that means those trees are likely decayed. Yes, that means that they may be more likely to fail, but in low occupancy areas, that's okay. And that fits within our risk tolerance and things like that, if we're giving them adequate benefits, sort of viewing the benefits of them. And so let's just remember that these cavity nesting species are totally reliant on us as arborists to not be removing every tree that has a cavity on it and every tree that has decay. I wanted to give one more example of what sort of a new tool that we have, and a way to consider approaching trees. A lot of our best management practices and how we approach trees are really focused on small young trees. And so when we look at how we're going to prune this tree, what the options are, probably first of all, we would just remove this tree. But let's say our client's really excited about the wildlife habitat and doesn't want to remove this tree. we have basically two options, right? We have a removal cut or a reduction cut. And our removal cut removes our cavity. So our cavity nesting species may not be able to succeed there. And our reduction cut, you know, I'm not sure that's going to take enough weight off of this branch to reduce the risk of failure into the house enough that that's really appropriate for this situation. So what might be appropriate for this situation is a heading cut. And when we're managing these over mature trees, these trees later in their life, we should be considering tools that we might not consider for young tree pruning and approaching them slightly differently. And I've been seeing a lot of discussion about this, a lot of arborists talk about this. There was a whole presentation on Coronet Cuts 2 days ago. And so we can see all sorts of different ways that people are working on this. And so a coronet cut is this cut here, right? So mimicking a natural fracture in a tree with a chainsaw, sort of chainsaw carving. I'd say mostly for aesthetic reasons, but also allowing decay to get in there, you know, appreciating that decay is an important part of wildlife habitat in our urban forests. And there may be situations where we want to encourage that. So Brian French and I teach workshops up here in the Pacific Northwest, sort of all around these ideas, crazy things that Brian does with his chainsaw, like carving out cavities and for cavity nesters. And there's a great article in the, what do they call the ISA magazine, Arborist News, a couple of years ago, where he really shows exactly how to do this with his chainsaw. This is growing a little bit in popularity in California. I've seen a few people send me videos and different things that they're working on. And so I think that that's really great. And I'd like to see more of it. It's also crazy, right? We should not be going out there doing this all the time. It's something we really want to be focused on the sort of benefits and costs associated with it, but a tool that we can start at least considering using and maybe implementing in our urban forest. Okay, Kara, that is most of what I have for today. What I was thinking though is if you think it would be helpful, I've got Courtney's pre-work inspection video to give people an idea of what a pre-work inspection from a wildlife biologist might look like. And maybe I'll play that and you and I can talk a little bit about it and kick off the Q&A from there. What do you think of that?
That sounds like a great idea.
Okay, so this is a pre-work inspection that Courtney did in Southern California, where she doesn't find, you know, she doesn't see any wildlife. She's just looking for signs of nesting wildlife. So think about how you might go out and do your pre-work inspection while you're watching Courtney do this. And here we go.
Hello everyone. So I am bringing you with me on a nesting bird survey for some trees that need to be trimmed for a utility company. And I wanted to show you guys some in-field clues that would tell you that there is a nest nearby without actually seeing the bird or the nest or hearing the bird actually. So I'm going to flip the camera around and I will show you what I look for when I look for nests. Hello.
One thing I forgot to mention is that we are seeing on the right side from last year, the handout that we used last year, and then this Arizona pre-work inspection form. So you can see how I'm sort of going along with her during her inspection, how I would fill that out. Again, I think we're going to try using the paper forms this year rather than this version, but we'll investigate that a little further. Oh, okay, here goes the pre-work inspection.
Hi everyone. So you are with me on a nesting bird survey, and some of the trees within this stand need to be trimmed for a utility company. And I am going to show you some things that I find in the field that show me that there is a nest without actually seeing the nest or the bird. And these are just things that I look for. So we're gonna take a walk. These are the trees that need to be trimmed. And I did a little walk through here. And I found some really interesting things in this palm tree. So I'm cheating a little bit because I know that barn owls like palm trees, just like this one, old, with a nice skirt. And I know that it creates a shelf, and essentially it creates a cavity. And barn owls are cavity nesters. So now what I'm starting to look for is whitewash, and basically any indication that there's a nest in here that, because I won't be able to see it. So let's look at the ground. And what I'm seeing here is, I'm seeing some feathers, particularly this one is a barn owl feather. Found that on the ground. I didn't plant it, I promise. And then now what I'm gonna look for is I'm gonna look for pellets, because I know that barn owls are really messy nesters. I will look for pellets and whitewash. So here's a very old pellet. There's a pellet. Oh, that's interesting. It's an old nest. Oh, with some eggs in it. Okay, back to the barn owl. There's some whitewash. It's very little, but some whitewash. Oh, and another barn owl feather. Perfect. And then let's see if we can find one more pellet for you guys. Okay, here's another pellet. This one looks relatively fresh. So these are just some of the things that I look for. The whitewash is not to an extreme amount that you normally see. Here's some more though. And I'm just looking on the ground directly beneath the palm tree. So this would lead me to believe that there is a barn owl nest. There either was or there is currently a barn owl nest in this palm tree. Now you're gonna say, Courtney, well, that's great, but owls are nocturnal. And I would say, yeah, you're right. So then what you would have to do is enlist a wildlife biologist to do a night survey to determine whether or not it's active or not. Barn owls have several clutches, and they can have 2 to 3 clutches in a season, so that could be active even this late in the game. Here's another feather. It could, and some whitewash. It could be active this late in the season, but you wouldn't know without a nighttime survey. So this is a good example of, you know that there could potentially be a nest in this tree, but you're not quite certain, so you'd have to enlist a wildlife biologist. And I hope that was a good example.
Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is stop sharing my screen and open it up to Kara and what Kara wants to talk about. I think that, you know, when I watched that video, I really think that, you know, Courtney's a lot better at this than I am. And she's taking these little tiny things and saying, hey, you know, we're not going to work in this area because of that. And I think that it brings up a question to me of like how, you know, how much sign is an indication that we're going to delay our work. And I think that what I'm most interested in from this program and from the wildlife trained arborists that we have here is to avoid the big mistakes, right? The obvious nesting situations where there's whitewash everywhere, when things like that. And I don't think many wildlife trained arborists are going to find this barn owl nest, and that's okay. We just wanted to show it as an example of what a wildlife biologist can do and how skilled they can be if you involve them in your projects. Did you have any takeaways in watching that card? Does that sound right?
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be hard even for a wildlife biologist to figure out if there's an active barn owl nest in that palm tree going back at night. So sometimes with that kind of information, you're just going to have to proceed with caution if it's during the season for a nest to be active. And the person who's up climbing the tree doing the trimming will have a better view of what's actually going on in the tree. So yeah, in that circumstance, them going in with the knowledge that there could be a barn owl nest, they can be more cautious and take their time trying to see what's going on in the tree. This one, please speak to nuisance wildlife, pack rats, acorn woodpeckers pounding on houses. And so my response to this was, and I'm not completely sure what Ruth was asking about here, but the point of the BMPs was more about reducing our impacts, protecting wildlife, rather than reducing conflicts with nuisance wildlife. So we don't really go a whole lot into this, although there is, and I don't know if we've got our new illustrations in there in the BMPs yet or not, but we will have an illustration of a wood rat nest to help folks identify it. But yeah, that this is more about protecting wildlife while getting our work done than it is about how to figure out how to deal with nuisance wildlife.
Well said, yeah. I think that we can appreciate that if we're managing our urban forests for more wildlife habitat, there's going to be more conflicts, and that's a problem that we're sort of anticipating, and hopefully we can deal with, specifically on an individual basis and try to come up with good solutions for. I'll point out that I believe the San Francisco dusky-footed wood rat is one of the wood rats that has special protections, is threatened or endangered at the state level. And we have more information about that in our California appendix. And so depending on where you are, these may have different protections and might influence how you want to deal with them. But that Kara and I do not really have expertise in nuisance wildlife and reducing conflict with them. I guess that's not true. You have a very specific skill set in electric utility maintenance.
Right.
Maybe not super applicable to what this person is dealing with.
Yeah, maybe not. But it's a difficult issue. Nuisance wildlife is a really difficult issue. All right, this next question is how do you ID squirrel nests versus large bird nests and determine if they're occupied? Do you wait 5 minutes, 15 minutes for activities? Are there different protections for squirrels and raccoons and mammal nests? And let's see. I just put in here that it is difficult to tell the difference between some of these nests until you're close up and can view them from above. But from the ground, squirrel nests typically look like a bundle of leaves and twigs, kind of spherical in shape, and raptor nests are going to look more like flat on top, but might have like a lot of sticks coming down to a point in the crotch of a tree or something. But definitely much easier to tell once you're up in the tree and can look from the top. And actually, I didn't really address the part of the question about different protections for squirrels and raccoons, mammal nests. For the most part, a lot of these species are not protected unless they're a special status species in the state that you work in. But our common squirrels and raccoons, possums, that type of stuff in a tree, they aren't usually protected. But a lot of the public won't be happy with you if you are destroying their nests or killing them in the process of doing your work.
Yeah, I think that this brings up issues of the climber safety as well, right? Because squirrels have really, really powerful jaws, and messing with them can be a really bad idea. And so I think that generally speaking, I don't think there's a good way. We haven't met anyone with real expertise in trying to determine whether these mammal nests are active without sort of going up and inspecting them. Since they have less protection, I think that's less of a problem, right? Where we sort of would envision a world in which we're protecting active mammal nests, but not giving them really any or much of a buffer. Removing branches around them is probably okay. But if you're removing the whole tree or something like that, that probably doesn't help much. I'd say that the whole best management practices are built around an avian biology system that sort of Kara has developed over the years, along with other avian biologists, and that we're trying to fit mammals into them in a way that I'm not sure makes a ton of sense, but we haven't found a better way to do it yet.
This next question is, should nests that are obviously abandoned, a previous season's bird nest, say, be preserved? Do birds reoccupy old nests? So I put in here that it depends on the species. A lot of raptors do reuse their nests, so do ravens and other larger species, but most of the smaller species don't reuse their nests, but they may use material from the old nest to build a new nest. Under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, it's illegal to be in possession of a nest. So your options are basically, you can leave it in place, which if that's an option because you're not removing that part of the vegetation, it's best to just leave nests where they are. If you are, then destroying the nest or leaving it on the ground are your options when you're dealing with a nest that is abandoned, is empty.
Great, thanks, Kara.
And then we've got a couple of new ones. Could a property owner rake the area and watch for sign in lieu of a night survey? If so, how long would you watch before work? That's an excellent idea. I hadn't really thought about that, but it would make it a lot easier. You could see when she was walking around the palm tree, all the dead leaves and debris that was making it hard for us, at least from the video point of view, to see whitewash and pellets and such. So that does seem like a pretty helpful option. As far as how long you'd watch before you do the work, I think it'd be great if it was possible to do something like that a week ahead of time. Give yourself as much time as possible. The more time you can give, the better, of course. But I'd say a week just to make sure you're not just dealing with a roosting bird versus perhaps a nest where you might see more pellets or more whitewash than you would with just a roosting bird.
Yeah, and I think this brings up the idea of like, if you have a cooperative homeowner, right, who really wants to protect the wildlife on their property and is concerned about that, then a lot of times they have a lot of knowledge about their property and can sort of help figure some of this out. Like, this would be really time intensive for us to figure it out. But if the homeowner can do some of this work of say like, hey, I raked and I didn't see much, you know, then you could maybe consider working carefully. That seems well within, you know, like the idea of doing the best we can, where we're not gonna never impact a nest, right? We haven't set out the best management practice to try to never impact a nest. We're trying to do the best we can and then act responsibly when we do find a nest in the middle of work and things like that as well.
For a Nuttall's woodpecker, I know an active nest consists of a nest with eggs or hatchlings, fledglings, but will it be an active nest if I observe a male woodpecker creating a cavity for during the fall or winter? That's a great question. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act does not consider that an active nest when birds are constructing the nest. So basically, until you have eggs laid, the first egg laid, a nest isn't considered active under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. If you live in a state like California, that's typically also the case, but with it getting more and more gray the closer you get to an egg being laid, and it will be something that California Fish and Wildlife folks might interpret differently depending on who you're talking to. There's no clear guidance on this. And if it's a raptor in California, a lot of the times a nest will be considered active as soon as they start putting new material in a nest or building a brand new nest. That's where we typically consider the nest to be active.
Yeah, one of my few interactions with California Fish and Wildlife, you know, about a project I was working on where a raptor was building a nest. They said, no, it's considered active the moment they start building the nest. And that was, you know, my interaction with them that day led me to believe that I should have interacted with a wildlife biologist because they did not like me calling. Seemed that's part of why we recommend a wildlife biologist, was part of my experience on on that project.
We did get one more question in while we were talking. I get a lot of residents complaining that we are trimming dead from a tree that birds like to perch on. Are there protections for something like this? And the short answer is no. Migratory Bird Treaty Act doesn't protect birds from harassment, from you scaring them away, from, you know, anything that just causes them to leave an area. You would have to actively like hurt that bird, injure it, or kill it for that to be considered illegal. So yeah, like it's certainly a shame to have to take that tree down. But if that tree needs to come down, then the birds are not protected from just perching.
Yeah, the only time that really habitat, so anything besides nesting, gets any protection is with endangered species, right? So endangered species have critical habitat, and anyways, that's a big topic for us to try to cover, but there's basically no other roosting or perching habitat protection. And that doesn't mean it's not important, and we could consider, we often see, and you know, I don't have data, but I feel like dead branches are really important perches and things that we could, you know, try to find ways to preserve more of in our urban forest, but definitely not protected in any sort of meaningful way.
Well, I'd like you to talk more about how do we build our relationships with a wildlife biologist before it's an emergency situation, and also who pays them, and what kind of fees would we look at if we run into a situation?
All really good questions. Thanks for chiming in. So I have built up relationships with wildlife biologists in a variety of different ways. But one of them, you know, I sort of have been recommending to my clients and have hired myself sort of both ways. And I'll just say, like, as a consultant, right? So people, these are consulting wildlife biologists. I'm a consulting arborist generally. And so I'm very responsive to my clients that I have relationships with, or people who aren't my clients who I have relationships with, and they call with an emergency problem. And when someone I've never heard of calls with an emergency problem, I might not be as responsive. So building up this relationship can be key. And what I'd say is just start with some conversations with them about, you know, introducing yourself, introducing the sort of work that you do. And they're often really interested in and pretty familiar with tree care through sort of utility work. There's a lot of different ways that wildlife biologists can get involved in tree care, but most of my wildlife biologist friends go out on utility projects for utility work and deal with and help manage the crew there to sort of minimize impacts to nesting birds there. And so having each one, I think, will be different in terms of how they want to set up contracts, how comfortable they are giving you free information, you know, what it takes to sort of build that. And I've really built that through my birding friendships, right? A lot of my master birder course that I said I did at the California Academy, a lot of them were wildlife biologists and work professionally in that way. But I think that some, you know, phone calls from potential clients who are interested in just chatting more about it is a good way to do that. There's lists on the Tree Care for Birds website, and I have pretty good luck just doing a web search for consulting ecologists. Seems to work better for me than wildlife biologists for whatever reason. I certainly know of other cities in Southern California that have on-call wildlife biologists, you know, consulting wildlife biologists that go out and work with those cities, do this sort of pre-work inspections and nesting surveys and things like that. So they're definitely out there, and I can help you connect with them one-on-one if you need that. But yeah, ultimately, the owner pays one way or another, right? I think that we can acknowledge that this is a really difficult situation to navigate, where we're not comfortable doing work without there being a survey done. And if the owner hires, you know, some random person to do a survey who doesn't have the credentials, or we're not very confident in, that doesn't really help us. And so I'm constantly working as a team on different projects and involved in that in my tree consulting. And I sort of see this the same way, where ultimately the owner pays for everything. How exactly it gets there can be really complicated. Often I'm a sub of a sub of a sub, right?
It does matter why the tree is being trimmed or removed. So I work for Southern California Edison. We remove trees on all sorts of different types of properties, private and agency managed and everywhere. And we pay for the survey, the pre-site inspection. All of that is Edison paying for it, because the reason the tree is being trimmed or removed is for our needs. Do you recommend any literature or field guides that can help with understanding bird habits and identifying species? And I just put in there, the Birder's Handbook is a really good place to start. It gives you a lot of information about the bird's natural history, where they nest, what their nests look like, the height in a tree that they might be in. It's all just a lot of great basic info on the birds of North America. RBMPs also have a lot of good information in there about bird habits and the timing of breeding and things along those lines. And for a physical guide, the Sibley guides are my favorite. But also, if you haven't used it before, download the Merlin app. It is amazing. You can use it to go through and try and identify what your bird is based on a description. You can use a photo. You can turn on the sound ID and just have it listening for you to tell you what you're hearing in the area. It's a really fantastic app and fun to just play with.
Yeah, I can't tell you how much I think Merlin's sound ID is going to change birding. If you know, I've played with it a little bit, and I think other people are playing with it a lot. And I'll just also say, I think allaboutbirds.com is a really good resource that for more of the like behavior, right? Of like, so the Sibley guide is good for like, oh, I think this is a house finch. And then I go to All About Birds and I'm like, oh, they build this kind of nest and they do this and whatever. And so I think that some combination of three things, and an app that does sound, a paper guide that does identification, and then All About Birds, you can learn a lot between those three. All right, for those of you that stayed with us until the end here, thanks for joining us today. Mostly I want to just give a big shout out to Kara and Ryan and Western Chapter. Thanks for the introduction, Andy. And thank you all for joining us. We'll be back on December 2nd. Remember, you have 2 homework assignments. One is to watch at least 2 videos and take the quizzes. And then what else was I gonna say? And then a pre-work inspection. You have until the end of, basically the end of November to get those done. We're gonna come back December 2nd. Look forward to seeing you for 3 different sessions. I'm gonna try to invite different panelists from different states to come join me and really dig into what's going on in those states, and really looking forward to that. So thanks, Kara, and thanks everyone, and we'll see you soon.